You're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Audrey Jackson. Audrey is the managing editor at the Christian Chronicle, where she does a great deal of international reporting, including photojournalism. Audrey has had work republished with us at Religion Unplugged throughout the last year due to our relationship with the Chronicle. And today, she'll be taking us behind the scenes on her work with a focus on her piece from last spring about the reparations of Turkish communities a year after the devastating earthquakes. Audrey, thanks so much for giving us some of your time today.
Thanks for having me, Matthew.
Yeah, so I think just to start, it might be helpful to sort of recap exactly what the story was. Why did you end up in Turkey, and who'd you talk to?
Sure. Wow, so many people I talked to. Gonna be hard to name them all. I originally reported on the earthquake in February 2023, and some of the relief efforts that were immediately taking place. There was a church in Antalya, the Antalya Evangelical Church, where Ramazan Arkan is the minister, and they were housing some of the people who were affected in the Hatay province. But the reporting I did in February 2024, a year after, I went over and met with One Kingdom, which is a West Monroe, Louisiana-based ministry relief organization that supports a couple Turkish ministries. And so I went over and kind of followed the relief and the work efforts that they were doing in the Hatay province.
Very cool. And was there anything that uniquely was compelling to you personally about the story that made you want to cover it a year ago and then want to follow up a year later?
I've covered a lot of natural disasters in my time with the Chronicle, and before I grew up in an area that regularly floods. I've seen tornadoes just destroy towns, but the scale and the magnitude of the earthquake devastation in Turkey was uncomparable to anything I've seen or witnessed in
Mhm.
person. So, having made those initial connections when the earthquake hit in 2023, I felt compelled to go back and follow up and see where things were because I knew that there was no way with the infrastructure in country that they could possibly be already back on their feet.
Right. And where were things compared to what you had expected them to be, maybe right before the trip, or maybe even a year before you left? Where what would you have expected? Um, what kind of progress would you have expected them to make in a year, and how did that compare with what actually had taken place?
I think from my Americanized perspective of how quickly we move with cleanup and aid, I was expecting a lot of the devastation in terms of buildings. I expected those to be demolished. I expected us to see a lot of empty lots, things like that, where the concrete had been cleaned up. That isn't actually where they were at in Turkey.
Mm.
When we got over there, there were a lot of half-standing buildings, buildings awaiting demolition, which, you could look at and it looked like the wind was going to blow them over at any minute. And these are
Mm.
not small buildings, these are multiple story buildings. So I think I was surprised by how much rubble was still there. They couldn't begin to start any type of development process yet or rebuilding because there was still so much that needed to be removed, but they really didn't have anywhere to put it.
Yeah. And while you were over there, did you hear any people kind of guesstimating as to how long it might take to actually get them back on their feet?
Yeah, I think the estimates I were hearing ranged everywhere from like 5 to 15 years, with 10 to 15 probably being the more realistic side of that.
Wow. Yeah. That is very different in the US for sure. Um, I'm curious, was there any single interaction you had with one of the survivors that was particularly moving to you in any way?
Hmm. We toured several, they're kind of called like container campuses, container homes. That's really the only amount of refuge that they can give right now to people who were displaced by the earthquakes. Since they're not in a rebuilding stage, there's a lot of containers that are brought in, like shipping containers that are renovated into homes for temporary housing. And so we toured some of those. And something that always strikes me that I've found in multiple places where you run into people who are faced tragedy or displacement is there's such a culture of hospitality that you might not
Mm.
expect. For instance, we were just looking at the dimensions and the layout of one of the container homes where a family was living. And these are tiny, tiny spaces. And there were probably 8 of us that day in the group. And she insisted the woman who lived there insisted on making us tea
Hmm.
as a welcome. We were only there for 5 minutes,
Hmm.
but it was something that was important to her to show hospitality to the Americans that had come to tour the area.
Wow. Yeah, and I your photo is really excellent. I particularly loved the one of the children receiving the toys from
Yes.
the responders. And I was impacted by how many of your photos featured children.
Mm.
What was some of the attitudes you found among them who are so little and have already experienced such like a massive disruptive event in their life?
The kids, for what it's worth, seemed very cheerful, very joyful. I think they were just very excited in every location we went because a lot of times that meant we were bringing both relief supplies and toy donations, clothing donations, things of that manner that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. So there was always a lot of excitement when the trucks distributing aid pulled up. Some of the children in container homes, they're going back to school. So as you'd be walking through on a tour, they're playing soccer in between the containers and just kind of getting back into what for them is now a regular flow of life.
Yeah, totally. And how exactly did you get connected with One Kingdom? To how did you choose them specifically?
Yeah, so the Christian Chronicle reports on Churches of Christ
Hmm.
nationally and internationally. One Kingdom is a ministry of the Whites Ferry Road Church of Christ in West Monroe, Louisiana, which for anyone who follows Duck Dynasty, that's Phil Robertson's church.
Oh, nice. Very
So we had previous connections to them because of that. And so I'd been looking for a way to get over and report on kind of the efforts happening at Turkey areas. And they reached out and said, hey, we're actually sending a team. Would you like to join us and kind of report on the relief efforts that are happening over there?
okay, very cool. And where all did you guys go? So you did some traveling to different areas?
Yes, so we flew into Antalya,
Okay.
which this is where it's going to get a little confusing geographically
Okay.
and by names because I was in Antakya and Antalya, which is different by one
Mm.
letter, but they're about 500 miles apart. So Antalya is where the church was that originally took in some people who were displaced by the earthquake. They're about 500 miles away from Antakya, which is the capital of the Hatay province, which is what was most devastated by the earthquake. So in Antalya, they weren't too affected, but they had a lot of efforts for those displaced.
Mm.
Um, and then I spent time in Adana, Gaziantep, and Antakya, which Antakya for Christians, they would know it as ancient Antioch. In Acts 11:26, it's where we were first called Christians. It's where the
Mm.
disciples were first called Christians. So it's got a lot of biblical significance as well. But that's where it was most damaged by the earthquake, and I spent time there.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Um, and was it mostly you mentioned in the story kind of the severe like the really incredible ratio between Protestant Christians and the overwhelming majority of Muslims there in Turkey. Was it mostly then serving and providing aid to Muslims? I know you obviously partnered with some churches there, but was it mostly were you just focusing on Christian churches, or was there also aid to the Muslim communities as well?
Yes, so there were multiple Islamic organizations that I know were working in the area. The organizations I was reporting on, which is First Hope Association, which partnered with One Kingdom and the Antalya Evangelical Church, they are a faith-based, Christian faith-based nonprofit that operates in Turkey. And so they were the ones with the trucks that were handing out relief items that you saw to children.
Okay, but and so was that though? So that was to everybody in each
Yeah,
village.
everyone.
Yeah,
They,
right.
since it is a predominantly Islamic country, they do not direct aid towards one faith group or another. Actually, First Hope Association as a NGO, that would be illegal. It would violate their terms of agreement with the government and what they can do. So they're very good at being inclusive.
Very cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I this may not have been a factor at all, but I always think it's interesting in some of my own coverage of disaster and just being around um, different relief efforts and things like that. Um, it seems like there's often this like philosophical difference that people get really caught up in and can have some really strong opinions about in the Christian aid relief communities, which is that it seems like there's two sides where it's sort of there's the people who think that providing aid and relief is an essential Christian good, and it's the way that we serve them. And if we're serving people who aren't Christians, we certainly hope that maybe they'd be compelled to talk to us about our faith, but our focus is not evangelism. And then there's the other side that I've seen where also people are very opinionated on this side, um, that says evangelism should be a fundamental part of providing aid, and they have to go um, hand in hand. And even on the story when it was republished on our site, there was a guy in our comments section who said something about that. Was that even a conversation happening? Was this were Do either of these organizations have an official stance on that? Was there people discussing it who were just volunteers? What did you sort of see in terms of evangelism in that?
Sure. I actually raised some of those questions myself because I was curious where they stood. In terms of First Hope Association, sorry, I got choked up.
No
In terms
worries.
of First Hope Association, which is the Turkish nonprofit, that is not their first degree of concern. Their first degree of concern is providing for the needs of the communities that they're now in charge of. So, in the container homes that were supported and funded by First Hope Association, you had mental health counseling centers, you had clinics, you had coffee shops, food pantries, and you actually had a mosque. So they had set up a temporary mosque for the people who were living in those container communities to worship because they understood that they were not going to come through with an immediate faith change.
Mm,
And that was also something they were not trying to push. For
mm,
them, the act of doing good under a Christian name as a faith-based organization, they see that as their mission of spreading the gospel. Just doing an act that is selfless is enough to, in their mind, plant a seed. One Kingdom also reiterates that goal. I think I included some of that in the article, where they see this as a long-term mission field. This is not time to prioritize and take evangelism to a disaster zone and spread it. They think it's going to be those communities that they make inroads through relationships with long term.
totally, that makes sense. So they sort of share that vision, and they're both kind of in that camp. That's cool.
Mhm.
And what did the makeshift mosque look like, if you don't mind me asking? I wouldn't even know what the fundamental requirements for that would be to still qualify as a mosque, but to be obviously not as ideal as it could be.
I did not go inside, so I can't
Okay.
give too much from the outside. It looked like a pretty standard, moderate sized shack that had been constructed. It was a lot of steel and tin from the outside. So that's about as much as I can expand on that.
No, totally. That's all good. Was there anything in the story that kind of didn't make it into the final published piece, but that you found really moving or interesting? Just anything like that?
There were two things actually that I was thinking of this morning, kind of anticipating this interview. One was that the church in Antalya, one of the things they were doing a lot with church leadership, in supporting the displaced communities that were still around them, is they were holding trauma informed conferences and clinics, which is really interesting because the way they explained it to me is that in Islamic culture, it's almost to be questioning God. Um, if you have a lot of questions or you're trying to process negative emotions, it should be enough that you can just rely on your faith, and not dwell on what has happened to you. So what they were trying to do was bring in a more mental health counseling perspective where they were going through and processing PTSD, and kind of the stressors that come with that and how that continues to walk out and affect your daily life and be supportive of those communities in an informed way. So I thought that was really cool. The other
Yeah.
thing was in the Hatay province. So if you look at a map, the Hatay province is on the Syrian border. And Turkey has somewhere around 3 million Syrian refugees. It has a very high amount, and a lot of those live in the Hatay province because it's right across the border. And so you had a displaced community already living there. And when all the buildings in the Hatay province, 80% of the buildings were deemed either irreparably damaged or destroyed.
Mm.
So pretty much the entire city was wiped out. And a lot of the Syrian refugees who were living there illegally could not find legal container housing. So a lot of them are now living out in the countryside in tents. So we toured a
Mm.
couple like tent villages, which this is at the time I was there in February, it's freezing. It's damp,
Mm.
it's cold, it's wet. So it was interesting to see how a already displaced community was being even more affected, but having a lot less aid flowing to them because of their legal status.
Wow. And is the understanding that they'd been there for a year,
Yes. Yeah, they've been
living in
in
a
the
tent for a
tent
year?
villages for at least a year. And a lot of them had previous apartments or homes, places they were living within, like Antakya in the Hatay province. But when those all came down with the earthquake, their only recourse, because they didn't qualify due to their legal status for container homes, they had to go into tents.
Wow. Yeah, wow, that's incredible. And do you have any updates on that or on anything else kind of in the area? I mean, I know it's been a year and there's other
Yeah.
stories, but what updates do you have?
I know they're still working in the area. Last I heard from First Hope Association, even though they can't offer container housing to Syrian refugees, they were still making supply runs out. So they would take relief aid and organization items out there. They'd take, toys and food, water, dental hygiene, things like that out there.
Totally. Yeah, and I mean, you do a lot of traveling. It seems like you've kind of been all over. Um, what were some of the things about Turkey that were unique, like just culturally, even
Hmm.
as opposed to some of the other places you've been?
Turkey is a little bit of an interesting place,
Okay.
depending on who you ask and what category it falls under. A lot of people debate whether it's the Middle East or not. Um, it's very interesting because depending on where you are, it can change. So when I was in Antalya, it feels very much like Eastern Europe,
Mm.
with a heavy Islamic influence, but most of those living in the city are agnostic or not strict adherents to Islam. So it feels very Eastern European. You can get about anything you need. And then as you go out in the rural areas and the countryside, you find more strict religious codes and a little bit of a different culture. And you find a more Arabic influence, a lot of times from Syrian refugees coming in. And so that part feels more Middle Eastern compared to the cities, which feel like Eastern Europe. Um, but I just find that their entire culture is very hospitable. They're all very welcoming. They're very kind. They want to make sure that you're taken care of. And that's just something I really appreciated.
Totally. Yeah, and was there anything as a Christian yourself, was there any ways that this kind of stretched and grew your faith?
I think more than stretched or grew my faith, I found myself really admiring the approaches that the organizations working there took.
Mm.
As you were saying earlier, there's kind of two camps you find a lot of times with Christian relief work. I've seen both of those camps up close and personal multiple times. And so I really appreciated how their agenda was first, let's meet the needs of the people. Let's form relationships. We don't have to start a debate. We don't have to start convincing them now. But let's just sit with them and have tea. Let's just
Mm.
have a meal with them. Let's just make sure that they are getting mental health counseling. And I really appreciated that approach.
Totally. Well, Audrey, I think we've covered most of the things I wanted to talk about, so I'll just sort of end on this. And I know you can't always in this business talk about what you're working on, but if you can talk about anything, what are you working on? What's next? What can we expect from Audrey Jackson?
I'm headed to Cambodia in less than 2 weeks. So I'm going to be reporting on kind of medical missions to rural villages in Cambodia. And it's a joint operation between some US doctors who are coming into the country, as well as some military doctors who already serve in Cambodia. And I think an Australian doctor is coming as well.
Very cool. All right, that is Audrey Jackson. managing editor at the Christian Chronicle. Audrey, thanks again so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.